Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mystery and Reason Lecture 6.3. At the end of the previous lecture, we started talking about investigations, and so we'll focus on those now, which will sort of be a natural continuation of what we were already doing with arguments and argument evaluation. So, what is an investigation? Uh, like I said, this is not really a new topic because many of the examples of arguments we've considered have come from investigations or inquiries into things such as crimes, disasters, or simply the mundane problems of everyday life, like my scratched car or whatever it may be, right? So in a way, if you think of an investigation as just the process of carrying out an inquiry, trying to answer a question, then every argument that we've looked at has been part of an investigation because there's an implicit question that the author is always trying to answer. But more specifically, what we want to address is how to actually carry out investigations. And that's going to mean how to look for new support that will make our arguments better. So we don't just want to evaluate an argument and say, oh, it's not very good. End of story. We want to make it better. We want to find the best answer to the implicit question that takes into account all the relevant support or evidence or information that's available. And if information is not yet available, but we can do something to make more information available, that's the sort of thing we want to do. Okay. Um, so here's a quote from Larry's book. We will sometimes be content to evaluate reasoning we find in a passage or conversation and let it go at that. We judge the argument offered to be good or bad, sound or not, and move on to other things. When a matter is important to us, however, we will often want to improve on what we're given. That is, when we find that the support offered does not favor any particular rival, or that it supports the one that it does only weakly, we may care enough about the IQ to find this unsatisfactory. We would like a truly good answer, not just the best of an indifferent bunch. Okay. So we that's sort of going against the spirit of what we've been doing because we started out by saying, look, it's hard to know how good of an answer a certain rival is just by looking at it in isolation, or I should say, just by looking at the author's conclusion in isolation. But if we compare it to other rival answers, we can rank them, and that's an easier way to say how good it is by saying that it's better than other possible answers. But of course, the drawback there is if all of the answers are relatively bad, then being at the top of the ranking might not mean that much. And so we really want to make sure that that our answer, whatever we have at the top of the ranking, isn't just good based on what we know now. We want to make sure that it's good based on what we could possibly know. So we want to make sure we've, dotted our I's and crossed our T's and really investigated the case thoroughly. That's what we want to start doing now. So, how to pursue an investigation? How do we do it? How do we guide our search for new information that will improve our argument? Here's another quotation. We may do this by extending our relevance judgment. Remember, we we judge, we articulate the relevance of a premise or piece of support by saying how it affects the ranking of the rivals. And that's just a judgment. It's one of the many judgment calls we need to make when we're doing this sort of stuff. We need to say, does this piece of information support this rival or that rival? Does it go against this one or that one? And so on. So the skill that allows us to pull relevant data from a passage to find the support that's going to be relevant to the conclusion for doing schematization, that just means for writing up the argument, right? That skill may be adapted to lead us to more relevant data that's maybe not in the passage, but we now have to figure out where to look for more relevant information, more support. It turns out the very same thing that guides our recognition also guides our search, and it's the serious rivals. So we can recognize that a piece of support is relevant by seeing how it affects the rivals and their ranking. And we can search for more support by looking at our list of rivals and thinking about what would be relevant, what information would be relevant either for or against one of these rivals. In other words, here's the key question. We look at each of our serious rivals and ask what kind of support might raise or lower this rival in the ranking? Or another way of putting it, what evidence would show that this rival is true or false? So support, evidence, information, premises, I'm using those interchangeably now. Um, and so we can pursue our investigation by searching for that kind of evidence or support. That's how we'll pursue investigations. Look at the rivals, ask what kind of support would be relevant to them, and then search for that kind of support. Okay. So let's do an example. Do you remember the car crash case? A car crashed. No attempt was made to brake or steer before impact. Therefore, we concluded that the driver fell asleep at the wheel. Okay. I found a new image this time. Okay, so the question was, why did the crash occur? The author's answer is the driver fell asleep at the wheel. The rival conclusions we listed were maybe the driver was intoxicated, but not asleep. We put that in there so that it doesn't overlap with C1. The car skidded on ice. The driver was attempting to commit suicide. The brakes and steering both failed. The driver was distracted. Um, and the driver, oh, here's a new one, actually. I don't think we had this one last time. The driver died before the crash. So they weren't just asleep at the wheel, they were dead at the wheel. Maybe they had a heart attack or some other medical, they died of some sort of natural cause, and then they were unable to stop the car from crashing, of course, right? Okay, so those are a bunch of rivals. If we wanted to figure out more, like if we're not satisfied with the fact that, so the only information here is that the car crashed and that it looks, for some reason, we can tell that no attempt was made to brake or steer. Of course, that itself might be a conclusion that's being inferred from other things. So there might be a more complex argument behind the scenes here. But, that's very minimal support for saying, well, the driver must have fallen asleep at the wheel. It's like, well, what about all these other rivals? Are we really sure? I mean, we didn't actually do a ranking here. Should we do a quick ranking? Let's see. Let's see if I can do this. So, what's the most plausible situation here? I mean, falling asleep at the wheel, that's something that could happen for many reasons. Maybe, they are sleep deprived. Maybe they accidentally took a medication that makes them drowsy. Although I guess, well, yeah, no, that wouldn't, no, yeah, C2. So they could have been intoxicated and then fallen asleep, right? Um, so this does seem like a pretty plausible thing. How plausible are any of these other ones? Intoxicated but not asleep? Sure, that's also pretty plausible. Does the support favor C1 versus C2? Not necessarily, although maybe if they're intoxicated but not asleep, they would at least badly attempt to steer, you would think. Or maybe they're just so out of it, they're just like staring at the, ceiling of their car and they just crash. So I would say that C1 is slightly more plausible than C2. Um, C6, distracted driving. They were texting. That seems pretty plausible. Maybe even more than falling asleep, honestly, especially nowadays, right? So I'm starting to think that for the ranking, we might put C6 at the top, C1, and then C2. Those all seem pretty plausible. Um, so what about the other ones? The brakes and steering both failed. That seems pretty unlikely. Attempting to commit suicide, I think that's pretty unlikely. Most people, I would think most suicides are not done in this way. It doesn't necessarily, crashing your car doesn't really guarantee that you're going to die. You could just be seriously injured. I think, people are usually going to resort to other means. So, died before the crash, that seems pretty unlikely as well. How many people, die while they're driving? If you're having some kind of heart attack or some episode, you'd think you might have a chance to pull over. Um, Skidded on ice. Well, that's one that we're going to talk about in a second when we talk about how to pursue the investigation. That could be plausible if there's ice around, but if there's not, then it's pretty implausible. So C3 is kind of like we definitely want more information on that one, right? But of course, skidding is something that can happen if there is ice. So maybe I'll put a gap in the ranking, and then I'll put the ice, and then I'll put the suicide, brakes and steering both failed, died before the crash, something like that. Whoops. Okay. Okay, well that's not really what we're trying to focus on right now. What we're trying to focus on is, we don't know a lot here. We would like to improve our analysis and our evaluation here. So what kinds of things should we look into to see if the ranking might change, and maybe we can get a more solid ranking that isn't likely to change if we gather all the relevant information. Okay, so that's what we're going to do now. Okay, so here are the rivals. Here's distracted driving, I suppose. Okay, so by thinking about what would be relevant to each rival, that will lead us to pursue different lines of inquiry or investigation. So here's what Larry says about C2 and C7. Autopsy results, right? If we want to know whether they were intoxicated. Oh, so we don't even know if they died, honestly. It didn't say that the driver died, but maybe let's assume that they did, I guess. If they didn't die in the crash, of course we could just ask them, what happened. And so we wouldn't really, so let's assume the driver did unfortunately die. So C2 and C7 might we would want to do an autopsy for that. This is something we would almost always do, I would think, in a case like this. So autopsy results might affect the status of C2 and C7. An examination of the car's steering and brakes. So look into get a mechanic to look at the car. That'll tell us something about C5. Looking into the driver's background and recent history might help us with C4 if we have some people that know the person, and we might be able to determine if they're suicidal. We could look for a suicide note in the car, right? This history might also provide relevant information for C1. If they fell asleep at the wheel, we might be able to find something about their recent schedule if they were sleep deprived or whatever, right? The driver's phone could be a source of evidence for C6 if they were, if we look at the texts that they were sending or something like that in the timestamps. As for C3, like I said, all we need to know are the road's conditions. If there was no ice, then this is simply not a serious rival. And we can hopefully tell if there was ice like right there where they would have skidded on it. And so C3 we can find out pretty quickly unless some time has passed and all the ice that was there has melted. Okay. So these are the ways we go about investigating. We look at each of our rivals. So this also shows you why it's so helpful to have a list of rivals. Just like in a murder investigation, having a list of suspects, we want to pursue each of those leads, right? And this is how we do it. Okay, let's do another one. Let's go back to okay, so I'm repeating stuff here because this used to be the beginning of another lecture. Let's look at the Flight 544 case. Remember, it entered the storm, and we've had no word from them for 6 hours, and they're 4 hours overdue, and we think that the plane crashed or was otherwise destroyed. Possible relevant support for that, for the author's conclusion. How can we, if we want to confirm that the plane was destroyed, we would look for what? Let me give you a chance. What do you think we would be searching for here in our investigation? We're trying to search for support that would be relevant to the rivals, i.e., evidence that would raise them in the ranking or lower them. I should have said raise or lower. I think I ran out of room for that. But so, of course, we would look for reports of explosions, smoke that people may have seen billowing up from the crash site, loud noises if it crashed near, somewhere where somebody could have heard the explosion or whatever, debris washing up if it crashed into the ocean or something like that. So these are things we could look for. Or I could have just said if we would want to look for the crash site, of course. Maybe that was too obvious to be worth mentioning, but we should mention it. Of course, we want to look for the plane, right? And then these are other things that would help us to confirm C1. How would we tell, what would we look for to see if they maybe made an emergency landing somewhere other than their destination? So what would be some possible relevant support for that rival? Well, reports of planes descending far away from airports. If somebody, lives in a rural area with, hundreds of miles from an airport and they see a commercial plane, descending, they might be like, that's weird. I might want to, call that in. And so maybe we can find a report of something like that, right? Okay, the plane is still in the air. That's a possible arrival. What would be relevant to determining that? Well, radar, right? We could maybe find them on a radar map. We might want to know, how about this? Information about the fuel capacity of the plane. If they've been going for an extra 4 hours compared to what they were supposed to be, for how long compared to how long they were supposed to be flying, could they potentially be out of fuel? Or if they have enough fuel, then maybe they are still in the air, right? So those are just some examples. You could probably come up with a lot of other things, but this is the sort of stuff we would want to look into in order to try to solidify our ranking to see if one of these is going to be raised or lowered by new evidence. Okay. Now, a couple lectures ago, we distinguished between specific and general support. If you remember, I did the overwatering the plants example. Remember, we call it a piece of support is called specific if it is specific to the case at hand, and it's general if it applies to many similar cases. That's a rough definition of these terms. In the two examples we've just considered, the car crash and the flight, most of the lines of inquiry most of the lines of inquiry have been looking for specific support, looking into the details of this case. But we can also search for general support. Actually, the very last example I gave on the previous slide, which was looking into information about the fuel capacity, in a way that's more general because we would be looking at how much fuel any plane of that type can hold. And then, of course, we could also look at, the fueling log, which I assume there is, and to see if they made sure they filled the tank. And we could ask them how much they put in it, but we could also just say how much fuel does a plane of this model hold? That would be more general because it would apply not just to this plane, but all planes of the same model, right? Right. So that's not specific to Flight 544. So that would be looking for general support. General support, so specific support gives us more information about this case. General support helps to increase our background understanding or knowledge of how things usually work or what typically happens in cases that are similar to the one at hand. With an increased understanding, we are then able to appreciate the significance of certain pieces of specific support. So, knowing more about cases like this, knowing more general information, can help us to understand what a piece of specific support should be telling us, right? Somebody who's an expert in the kind of in planes is gonna, you know, look when specific support is found, we want the expert to look at it because they're going to bring their background knowledge to bear on making a relevance judgment about how a piece of specific support is relevant to the case. Okay. Wright says, we cannot compensate easily for every lack of understanding we might have. Sometimes nothing we can add to an argument will allow me to appreciate an item of specific support. Grasping it might require years of study or training. For example, understanding the reason that physicists think quantum gravity requires a certain number of dimensions, extra dimensions of space. That's a very obscure piece of, mathematical physics that's you can't just be given a quick explanation of. I mean, there are like YouTube videos where people are getting pretty good at communicating these difficult, scientific concepts to the layperson. But still, if you really want to understand what's going on, you need to take courses, you need to, get degrees and so on. And these sorts of things could just be beyond a given person altogether. So general support is not always easy to come by. Specific support is the kind of stuff that we're looking for evidence about this case. General support is general knowledge that we might not have or we might not be capable of easily learning. But if we find an expert, they're going to be the kind of person who can bring that knowledge to bear on the specific support. Okay. So speaking of experts, let's talk about that for a second. So recall the example of the overwatered plants. The author in that case didn't have enough background understanding of plant care to know that overwatering can encourage root fungus. And so that was what their neighbor told them. Their neighbor had more background understanding. You could say that their neighbor had some expertise in the matter. And so even though their neighbor wasn't familiar with the author's specific plants, they knew what plants in general are, how plants in general work. Okay. Here's what Larry says. Sometimes we can exploit other people's understanding to supplement our own, and hence evaluate data that are beyond our comprehension. We appeal to experts, which just means those who understand things that we do not. To use the testimony of experts as support for a conclusion, we must still understand a lot about human beings and their perceptions and motivation. So, of course, an expert witness, an expert, that's helping us in an investigation, we still need to make sure that they're trustworthy, that they really have the degree that they say they have, that they got it from a reputable institution, that they have been working in the field recently and didn't like leave that career behind a long time ago, that they are keeping up to date with new research and things like that. And so those are things that we can, look into about the expert. It's to see, we might want to know if they're biased for some reason. Even if they have a lot of knowledge, they might be biased in a way that would be problematic for the case at hand. Okay. But sometimes we can do this even when we cannot understand an esoteric or technical matter that experts can. In this way, we can extend the reach of our reasoning indirectly. Okay. Um, so even if we don't fully understand what the experts do, we can use their judgment, we can use their knowledge and everything else we know about the case to arrive at a solid conclusion on our own. Not on our own, but we can be the ones who are doing the reasoning, and we're drawing on specific support that we find and general support coming from experts. Okay. So one more thing for this lecture. Now that we've seen what is involved in investigations, we have a new concept we can use for evaluating arguments. So far we have said that an argument is called sound, an inductive argument. So remember the term sound was previously used for deductive arguments. Let's set that aside. A sound argument in what we've been talking about in Larry's chapter 4 is an argument where we, the evaluators, think that the author's conclusion is at the top of the ranking, that it's the best answer to the IQ, right? Now we will say that an argument is strong, and this is going to be better than sound, if, first of all, it's sound, i.e., C1, the author's conclusion, is at the top of our ranking of serious rivals, and furthermore, we judge that it is very unlikely for further evidence to lower C1 in the ranking. In other words, it's a strong argument. We say that it's a strong argument if we think the author's conclusion is the best, and we think it's likely, highly likely to remain the best answer, that we think it's very unlikely for there to be more evidence than what we found so far that would lower the author's answer below some other rival. Okay. Now, the concept of a strong argument was something we also introduced early on when we were distinguishing between deductive and inductive arguments. And there we just said a strong inductive argument is one where the probability of the conclusion being true is very close to 100%, given that the premises are true. Well, that's pretty much the same thing we're saying here when we say that it's very unlikely for further evidence to lower C1, except we're doing this in a more dynamic way where we're imagining that the investigation has developed over and we've looked into more things. We haven't just looked at the original argument, but we've pursued all of our leads and lines of inquiry. And then we say, okay, how likely do we think it is for the author's conclusion to be true or to remain at the top of the ranking, given anything else that could turn up? So it's similar to what we said before, but we're defining it in the context of, implicit question, rivals, ranking, which is concepts that we didn't have when we were first discussing strong inductive arguments. Okay, so this is the concept of strong argument that we'll be using now. Here's Larry's discussion of the concept. When we securely infer that the noise in the kitchen was a breaking glass, remember that example? We imply that further inquiry is unlikely to disclose anything that would reverse our judgment on these conclusions. So think about that example, right? We hear a crashing sound in the kitchen. We walk in there and there's a broken glass on the floor. Nobody else is at home. There's no other sources of, broken glass sounds anywhere nearby. We check all the windows. No other glass seems to be broken. It seems very unlikely that some other rival would become more plausible than the glass being the source of the sound. So we could call that a strong argument. And when we get a strong argument, it's sort of like we're saying case closed. So it's like the investigation is complete when we arrive at what we consider a strong argument. Okay. If we have doubts about strength, this is the question to ask. How plausible is it to suppose that ideal evidence would demote the number one rival? So ideal evidence, like if we knew everything, is there, what else could it be? Could it have been the sound of a broken glass on the neighbor's television that's like blasting so loud that I actually confuse the sound of that from something in my own house? Even that doesn't seem that plausible. And that would be like, if we really, that would just be, that's like one of the only other things we could think of, right, that could possibly be causing the sound. So we say that the conclusion of a strong argument is a decisive answer to the implicit question. It's not just the best answer now, it's the best answer, all things considered. It's decisive, and we say case closed. Okay. Finding such an answer means the investigation is complete. Okay. Now, none of this is 100%. Remember, we're not talking about valid deductive arguments where the conclusion is 100% guaranteed to be true based on the premises being true. We're still talking about strong inductive arguments, which maybe the conclusion has a 95% or higher chance of being true, but usually that's good enough for real life, right? And so we can say the investigation is complete even if there's a small chance that things might change later on, right? So of course, we can never know everything, and even when we imagine ideal evidence, we might not be thinking about all the possibilities, but we do our best, and if we feel 95% or more confident that this is the decisive answer, that's usually when we will say, all right, we're not going to investigate this any further. We've got it. Okay. Let's do one more example and then we'll call it for this lecture. So let's go back to the scratched car. So I combined some of the support because there was so many of them, but there was heavy winds last night. The metal garbage can was found under a bush. The car had new scrapes and scratches. The damage is at the height of the garbage can facing the can's normal location. The question was what scratched the car? The author's answer that was implicit, but they were pretty much figuring out that it was the garbage can, right? I found another image for that. Um, Maybe it was some other wind-blown object. Maybe it was a vandal, an animal, or maybe a collision while driving at some earlier date. Those were the rivals. Now, suppose, unlike last time, let's change it up again. Last time we said we found car-colored paint on a lawn chair, and that switched things up a little bit. Let's say we find car-colored paint on the garbage can, and that there are no other nearby objects that could have caused the damage. With this evidence, C1 appears to be the decisive answer. There's so much going for it, and the other rivals are no longer very plausible compared to C1. So now we would say that is a strong argument. Okay. The can has the car's paint on it. The scratches are in the right place. The can has clearly been moved. There was winds that could have moved it. Everything is pointing towards the can. We'll say that's a strong argument. We just won't have any particular reason to continue looking into this case, right? Good. So that's it for this topic, and I think well, I don't know what we'll do next. We'll see. I'll see you next time. All right. Bye bye.